Hello, everybody. This is going to be 4.1 Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire. This is the first part of Chapter 4, focusing on slavery. So, we're going to start with a quote from Aludo Equiano, who was an enslaved man who wrote an autobiography. There have been some questions about how autobiographical and how fictional the autobiography was, but it is still a heck of a primary source. And at one point he said life had lost its relish when liberty was gone, meaning that life had lost whatever flavor or goodness or joy that had been in it before slavery happened to him. So, Aludo Equiano, if we're talking about him, was captured. Allegedly, again, there have been some contention that he may have sort of um, made his story a little bit bigger, exaggerated perhaps a little bit. But according to his story, he was captured as a young man in Africa. He was enslaved in America. He learned how to read and write, and eventually he made his way out of slavery by paying his way out of slavery. However, unfortunately, this was not the case for most enslaved Africans in America during this time. Now, I've already taken a little bit of a look at slavery, the foundations of slavery in America, in the last chapter. Here we're going to focus more on the enslaved themselves. So, stories of enslaved Africans usually occurred at the same time as freedoms for white men were growing in America, or at least calls for freedom for white men were growing in the Americas, which is an interesting sort of juxtaposition, a counterpoint, and something that we'll talk about throughout the American Revolution as well. Calls for freedom while holding people captives as enslaved. The British and the American colonists in the buildup to the American Revolution were at the same time demanding more freedom while denying it to others. And this is something, like I said, the British took special joy in pointing this out during the Revolution. So, if we're talking about slavery, in the big picture, between 1492 and 1820, the estimation is that 7.7 million African people were brought to the Americas as enslaved people. Most of them came between 1700 and 1800. That is the time where slavery is flourishing, especially in British North America. Afterwards, many more enslaved people were born in the colonies, so the number is actually higher. And while now we condemn slavery, looking back on it at that time, it was part of the larger business model of America, conducted not just by the British, but by other European nations. So, in your presentations, we have already talked a little bit about mercantilism and about how all of these great countries are in competition with one another. Slavery is part of that equation. It is gruesome economics. And so the Atlantic slave trade was normalized from about the 1700s in America, in most of the American colonies, and there was a high demand for American goods. And this high demand for American goods required a large number of workers in the fields or doing the work to create these goods, which led to a high demand for enslaved people. Now, when we often talk about the triangular trade between America, Europe, and Africa, um, we think of it as a simple triangle. This goes that way, this goes that way, this goes that way. But it's actually several trade routes going back and forth across the Atlantic, both to and from America, to and from Europe, to and from Africa. It's not just one direction. And in general, if we're going to generalize again, which, hey, that's what we're here to do, raw materials and some American goods left America for Europe, and a few in Africa. And then the raw goods were turned into finished goods in Europe, especially for us in England. And then these English goods were sent back to America and sold back to Americans, or they were sent down to Africa. And enslaved people were moved from traded usually for these finished goods as well, usually weapons or rum, and they were moved down to enslaved people were moved to the Americas to continue this circular pattern of raw goods, finished goods, uh, enslaved people to make the raw goods to finished goods, so on and so forth. And there were many ports of call in this triangular trade, both in the north and in the south. Most of the enslaved people were actually being dropped off in the Caribbean, but those that were moving to America, many of them were moving to Charleston, South Carolina. However, a lot of the slave ships that brought the enslaved people over from Africa were from places like Boston and Nantucket and Providence, Rhode Island, and places like that. So, North and South participated in the slave trade, and a lot of America's wealth was generated by enslaved workers. To be free in America meant having the ability, to some degree, to enslave other people. So, this is a much more complicated version of the triangular trade, showing everything that's being moved back and forth. So, we are not just seeing a triangle, it's more like a wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff there. So, it's a ball of string. Now, Africa and the slave trade. So while Europeans are shipping Africans to the American colonies, most African kingdoms on the West Coast are participating in this. So it's not just like the African nations on the West Coast are just simply victims of the African slave trade. They are also participants in it as well. African kingdoms on the west coast of Africa were hungry for finished goods, textiles, guns, to a smaller degree, things like rum. And African states like the Ashanti and the Dahomey used these to grow their own and battle other African kingdoms. And so they were part of the larger mercantile trade that was going on. And slave trade was a lucrative business for African kingdoms. However, at the same time, it also led to African people being shipped off of the continent and enslaved either in Europe or more often in the Caribbean and the Americas. Now, the Middle Passage is the voyage by which African enslaved people moved from Africa to the New World, and it was incredibly dangerous, incredibly deadly. In order to make the most money, to maximize these profits, slave ships that carried these enslaved people in would basically cram themselves full of enslaved people, sometimes to the point of overcapacity, meaning that they had too many. They were doing some gruesome mathematics that you could assume that some would die along the way, and you would work your way down. And so they wanted to make sure that they were at capacity when they landed. Now, slaves were put into areas so small that they couldn't actually move. They were taken out onto the deck in order to get up and move. But for the most part, enslaved people were down in the hold. Disease was rampant. Women, especially, were also left at the mercy of the male crew. Assault was a dangerous possibility, especially for African women being brought over to the Americas. And overall, about 20% of enslaved people died on the way over. So about 1 out of every 5 people on the Middle Passage died on the way over. Some were died of disease, some of starvation, malnutrition, some were killed on the way over, some committed suicide on the way over. But in the end, it was about 20% who passed away. Those who survived were mainly sold in the Caribbean or in South America, but about 5% were sold to North America, which, if you consider the size of the African slave trade, 5% is still quite a few. So this is the slave trade in the Atlantic world. This is a map straight out of your book showing where most of the enslaved people were headed. And this is the plan of a British slave ship called the Brooks. And you can see in how it is set up that they are living cheek to jowl. They are living person to person with very little room for movement. And of course, in the larger sense, you are also sitting in your own waste for weeks at a time. It's a horrible way to go. So, let's look at different kinds of slavery. There were 3 main types of slavery in America, and I think it's important for me to say that this by no means is saying that there was good slavery and bad slavery. There were different vintages of slavery. There was tobacco slavery in the Chesapeake area, that's around Virginia. There was rice slavery in the southern colonies, and then there was the non-plantation slavery in the northern colonies. So at this time, all 13 colonies were engaged in the slave trade in some way. The oldest version is the Chesapeake. That is where the first known slave ships landed in 1619. A ship called the White Lion parked at Jamestown and unloaded some enslaved people and traded them for food. However, by 1770, more than 270,000 enslaved people lived in this area, the Chesapeake area. And this high demand for tobacco was really what brought the enslaved people to the Chesapeake. It meant that Virginia had huge amounts of mercantile trade with England, and it also meant that as Virginia was growing west, think about Bacon wanting to move west before his rebellion, slavery moved with the expansion. Now, most enslaved men and women in the Chesapeake were field workers. However, others were horsemen, boatsmen, skilled with craft, artisans. Oftentimes, women, if they were not in the field, were working in the house as cooks or maids or personal servants. Most enslaved people were part of larger plantations at that time. However, at this time also, we do see that many small farms, about 50% of them, had at least one enslaved person working on their farms. So this was not just large plantations, although the large plantations did have the lion's share of the enslaved. And these large landowners and large slave owning groups conducted a lot of the major political business of the Chesapeake, too. So, as we will see when we get to things like the Declaration and the Constitution, some of the largest slave owners in America were also the people who sort of held political power and mercantile power at that time. Now, as slavery grew in the area, so did the laws that restricted the rights and the freedoms of the American enslaved. And there were harsh punishments given for breaking these laws, especially for the enslaved. From running away to intermarriage, enslaved people were punished for what they did and what was viewed as illegal. And slavery became monochromatic at this time. Slavery moved away from being indentured servitude for whites and also slavery for African Americans and became more about one race, racial superiority versus racial inferiority. African enslaved people could not do things like own guns. They did not have the same rights as whites did. Most freed blacks were forced out of Virginia if they were freed. And so by 1750, the word free and the word white could be interchanged. Now, the Carolinas were settled mainly by whites from the Caribbean, and their first enslaved people there were natives. The folks like the Creek tribe, they traded Native American enslaved people to the English, and eventually they became worried about the fact that the British didn't seem to be slowing down their expansion, and that if they continued trading with the British and sending them enslaved natives, then the Creek could be next, basically, was their worry. Now, South Carolina was seeing similar divisions between the races as slavery is growing. And we see that Carolinian rice and indigo, which is an ink that was used to dye clothing, they were in very high demand. And the large plantations in South Carolina actually had more enslaved people than they had white freemen in many cases. It was over 50%. And many of the enslaved people are dying due to disease and overwork. And so the numbers of new enslaved people having to come in were growing all the time as well. And this disparity, this difference between the races, really worried South Carolina so much that they actually offered poor English immigrants passage to the Carolinas to try to balance out the numbers, to make it so that it wasn't that white people were the minority in South Carolina. And then there was Georgia. Georgia's a little bit different, and it's the last colony that we have not talked about. We've talked about 12 of them so far. Georgia was the 13th. And Georgia was created as a place for poor Englishmen to move to if they could not pay their debts. Instead of just putting them in jail for debt, the debtors are moved to America, to Georgia, instead of to prison. And this was the idea of a man named James Oglethorpe, who was a sort of upper-class British man who had lost a friend to the debtor's prison. And since the whole idea was that they're supposed to be learning how to make an honest day's work, slavery was initially outlawed in Georgia, but not forever. However, the settlers in Georgia really wanted to introduce slavery as a method of acquiring and gaining and continuing to gain their wealth. And so by the 1750s, Georgia had overturned the slavery ban and also the ban on liquor because they were supposed to lead good Christian lives. And Georgia basically became sort of a mini South Carolina at that time. So here, by the way, is James Oglethorpe, who had this idea for Georgia, and he said, if we allow slaves, we act against the very principles by which we associated together, which was to leave the distressed. And obviously his idea was shouted down by the rest of Georgia. Now, in the North, slavery made up a small portion of the middle and northern colonies. If you remember Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania was not a huge fan of slavery in the first place, based on their Quaker beliefs, but it was also practical, or impractical, as it were. The smaller farms in the New England soil meant that you couldn't have the massive plantations of the Chesapeake or the Deep South. However, there had been slavery in New England since the beginning. There were enslaved people working in farms and shops, as shipbuilders and as personal servants. Now, with fewer enslaved people and less chance of resistance, the laws were a lot less harsh in the North. In New England, enslaved people could generally marry, testify in court, and the harsher punishments of the Southern slavery was forbidden by law. Now, if you remember, the Dutch had introduced slavery to New York, and even Pennsylvania, Quaker Pennsylvania, with its resistance to slavery, eventually was worn down, and they had a few thousand enslaved people within Pennsylvania. However, the largest numbers were found as laborers in the big city, especially New York City and Pennsylvania, so this was not the field work of the Deep South. And many shop owners in the middle colonies also found that since the job market tended to grow and shrink, it was actually simpler just to hire white workers when it was going well and then fire them when it was going poorly, rather than take on the long-term lifetime investment of putting an enslaved person on your economic docket. Now, let's look at slave culture and slave resistance as well. It's important when we talk about enslaved people to remember that enslaved people are not one people. They are from numerous distinct African tribes, different languages, and different religions. The common bond in America became enslavement. It was a common bond between a diverse group of African people. And over time, their cultural differences sort of blended together and mixed together and melted with those of their white owners. And we saw a new African American identity being built in America, which is really against the whole idea of slavery. Enslaved people are supposed to be simply a continuation of the will of their owners. They're not supposed to have thoughts and ideas of their own. However, we see that creating your own culture is almost a form of rebellion in this way. Now, let's start with religion. Religion in West Africa was primarily spiritualist, similar to Native American beliefs. However, Islam had also made its way to West Africa. One of the wealthiest men in West African history is a man named Mansa Musa, who you probably met last year in your World Studies 2 class. And they were also heavily Islamic in West Africa. However, when they got to America, they were being converted to Christianity, and that is a difficult shift in their belief system. And so we see that, you know, people are being converted to Christianity. Enslaved people are being forced to give up their traditional African religions, viewed as witchcraft by white slave owners. And so what we see here is almost a melding, a blending of African religions and Christian traditions, leading to new religions in America and in the Caribbean. So we see, again, this sort of a lot of old ideas and old religions are being put together to form something new. This is not just a combination. It's almost like that video we watched of the guy talking about mestizo culture. He said, you know, I am not made up of all these components. All these components blend together to make me. And so here are some ritual items used in the practice of voodoo. This is the older African tradition that has been simplified into voodoo if you've ever been to New Orleans. Now, over time, different geographical locations also produced distinct types of African American culture. So just like there were different tribes in Africa, African Americans in the Chesapeake area may be different than ones in the Northeast or in the Deep South. In the Chesapeake, it was healthier for, especially compared to the Deep South. That meant that there could be more enslaved children because they lived longer, and they could live sometimes in family-based units, although they could still be sold by the yeoman farmers that they worked for. A yeoman farmer is basically a small farmer who has enough land to feed their own family and be self-sustaining. Many of these enslaved Africans also learned English. Many of them converted to Christianity, as we saw with the slave laws back in the 1600s in the last chapter. Christianity did not stop you from being enslaved. They made a law about that. In the deeper South, the low birth rate and the high death rate required a constant new additions of new enslaved people from Africa, which meant that fewer of them learned English and had fewer interactions with whites, which meant that there was almost a new language being formed of sort of African English dialects, most famous of which is called the Gullah Geechee language that still exists in some small islands off the coast of South Carolina. Now, in these areas, the enslaved people constructed houses that were more in the African style. They gave their children African names, and like I said, they sort of spoke a patois of different languages. English and African and French dialects sort of blended together. This is known as Gullah, like I said. The familiar relationships were also slower to develop because the death rate was so high, it was harder to keep this family together. Instead, Southern enslaved people in bigger cities like Charleston were assimilated into a more European-style culture. However, in the North, the fact that there were fewer enslaved people meant it was actually harder to create a strong African-American identity as well. They kind of blended into the Northern culture as well. So here is a cemetery in Hilton Head, South Carolina, Braddock's Point Cemetery, an African-American cemetery. And we see several cemeteries like this, sort of cemeteries for the enslaved and for traditionally African-American families. This was what Hilton Head was before it was turned into a giant resort. It was basically this small kind of Gullah village off the coast of South Carolina. Now, along with the common experience of slavery, the fact that African Americans were experiencing slavery sort of together, the other binding factor was that they were not taking this lying down. Slavery was not passive, which is, again, sort of something that people were meant to believe back then, that, an enslaved person, like I said, is just an extension of the will of the owner. However, the enslaved were resisting in a variety of ways, from violent to running away. Many tried to get to Spanish Florida, where slavery had been abolished. There had also been violent rebellions in the Caribbean and in America, including one in New York in 1712. But whenever they did rebel like this, the rebellions were put down very harshly, and the rebels were tortured and executed as a way to say, like, this is what happens to you if you do rise up and rebel. So here's a notice of a runaway slave. You'd often see these placed in local newspapers. This one you might notice is from a man named Henry Shaw. Henry Shaw was the owner of what became the St. Louis Botanical Gardens, or Shaw's Garden, or the Shaw neighborhood. If you ever go to the Botanical Gardens, they have an amazing history and archives, and a lot of it is devoted not only to Henry Shaw, but to the enslaved people that he owned, as a way to tell their story and continue their story. Now, all of this continued even through times of crisis. Enslaved people used war between the Europeans as a way of trying to acquire their freedom. So during this time, the English were fighting other countries. They were fighting the Dutch, they were fighting the Spanish, and enslaved Africans in America took advantage of these wars. During what was a weird war called the War of Jenkins' Ear between Spain and England, a group of newly arrived enslaved men from the Congo, stole weapons and marched south to Florida, calling for more enslaved people to join them. We see that this eventually became known as the Stono Rebellion, and it led to the deaths of 24 whites. They were killing people as they moved south. But also to the deaths of several hundred enslaved people as they marched south and were eventually met by British colonists who stopped their marching with guns. And actual rebellions, or the fear of actual rebellions, led to huge reprisals and strict laws against enslaved people, even if they were not actually involved in the rebellion itself. It was like you were close by, so guilt by association. Here is an image of the Stoner Rebellion from a newspaper at that time.